you have a connection with the ship that you live on. And you may think of it as a machine, but in many ways, she's a living thing. He went down there and tried to break up something, and they threw him in the fire. He said, I don't know why they sent you here. He said, because they hardly ever sent blacks here. I mean, tears was in his eyes because he didn't want to be left alone. He told me, I don't want to be left alone. It was a good job. It was a good experience, good adventure, you know.
It's the USS Mackinaw. This was a ship that was created to break ice, what's called an icebreaker, here strictly in the Great Lakes. It was built and commissioned in 1944, and this is now a museum. It was decommissioned in 2006. Now it's a museum talking about what the ship did and tell its story. But there were thousands of sailors that came on and off this ship between 1944 and 2006, and they all have stories. What I wanted to do is tell you the story of one particular sailor. As a matter of fact, I think I'll let that sailor tell the story himself.
My name is Kenneth Sr. I had served in the U.S. Coast Guard. As a matter of fact, I served in a few services. First one was the Marine Corps, Army National Guard, Navy Reserve, and I retired from the Coast Guard. Mackinaw is USCGC Mackinaw WAGB 83. That's its hull number. It's 290 feet long, 83 feet wide. It is a icebreaker. It carries 6 49-ton engines to help push it through the ice. It has 2 screws for your land lever that would be propellers in the stern or the back of the ship, and 1 in the front. What makes it special about the screw in the front is it pulls water from under the ice, allowing the Mackinaw to slide up on the ice and break through it. The story was that she was built by U.S. Steel. They paid for it and gave it to the Mackinaw. I gave it to the Coast Guard so that the Coast Guard could keep their Lakers, and these are vessels that carry ore and coal. That's their job, back and forth on the lakes without trouble, because the war was going on at that time. She was, at that time, made a little too wide to get out of the St. Lawrence Seaway locks. So she couldn't get out of the ocean, so she was virtually stuck in the Great Lakes. That's where she did all her breaking. I was a seaman. I had attended, because I was prior service, they sent me to a 6-week course in Alameda, California to learn how to be a sailor. And then they were looking to station me somewhere. And at that time, I was about to get married, and I didn't want to be too far from my prospective bride. So I asked for a ship that was close to Chicago. And the only thing that they could find for me was the Mackinaw, in Sheboygan, Michigan. When I showed up, after a long Greyhound bus ride, I showed up at night in Sheboygan, Michigan. Sheboygan, Michigan was at that time a very small town, if you could call it a town. It had snowed 3 feet, and I showed up there with my sea bag, and because Sheboygan was like a really small town that had 1 stoplight. It had a full-time sheriff and a part-time deputy. And he had gotten burned one time because they had a beach, and he went down there and tried to break up something, and they threw him in the fire. I might have been there about 8 months, maybe 9. They drove me to Sault Ste. Marie on the American side, and I met the Mackinaw. When I arrived on the Mackinaw, I reported on board. They took my orders and stuff, and they put me in the bow of the ship. That's where the beds were, the racks. They put me in the bow of the ship. And if you want to sleep, try sleeping while the ship is breaking ice, and you're right there where the hull is. So it was crunching and breaking ice and stuff. I got along with people, but I remember a conversation with the chief. I can see his face. I don't remember his name, but he had been on the Mackinaw like since the 50s, and this was 76. So he said, I don't know why they sent you here. He said, because they hardly ever send blacks here. He said, there's a standing order that if you send blacks here, they turn around and send you somewhere else. Because he said, I remember one black guy showing up here, and they got him out of here the same day. Well, there was 4 of us on board, okay? There was 4 of us. There was me, 2 other guys, and a guy named Kenny Johnson, and we were on board. I just remember Kenny Johnson and this guy from Chicago. I don't remember. I do remember the other guy. The other guy had been the only black on board for a long time, and he was even dating a girl in town. So while we were there, we broke ice. Sometimes if the ship got ice on it, you had to go out and break ice with a baseball bat so it wouldn't get top heavy, because the Mackinaw was built like a football on the bottom. It didn't go straight down like most ships. It was round like a football, and she rolled like really rocked back and forth. But this was also part of her design because it helped her break out. If she got stuck in ice, she could break out of the ice by rolling back and forth, because they used what they call healing tanks. They would pump oil from one end to the other, back and forth until she got free, you know. And so I kind of took a tour around the ship. I went down in the engine room, and I tried to stay in as much as I could because it was cold out there when you were on the lakes, you know. But we looked like a convoy because we would be in the head of the Lakers, and maybe 2 or 3 Lakers behind us, following in our track as we were breaking ice. And then when we did what they call flush the cut. We'd go to Sault Ste. Marie where the locks are, and we would just go back and forth, to make sure that the ice was broken up so the ships can move through the ice. The things that brought money in was federal funding for the schools, the toilet paper plant there, and the Mackinaw. Those were the 3 things that brought money into Sheboygan. You know, and the local guys were jealous of the Coast Guard because they had a steady income. These local guys didn't have jobs, some of them, you know, and they would just hang around. They had unemployment while, you know, the Coast Guard guys had the checks. So the girls went after them. The things that had taught me to survive in Louisville, Kentucky was still in place. So more so, you knew there were certain areas that you didn't go into. You know, there were certain areas, there were white neighborhoods that you didn't go into, or you get jumped. Some of these folks were not used to black people, and there was only one black family that lived in Sheboygan, and they were invisible. I never saw them. I heard about them, but I never saw them. You were noticed whenever people were going up to Mackinaw City, because everybody went up there for the fudge and everything. Every time people went up there, and if they were black, their tires would be slashed. It was the local people not wanting us into the neighborhood, you know. They tolerated us because we were on the ship, but if it looked like we were moving into their local culture, there was a problem, you know. And even though that first guy that was on there, and he was dating a girl from the community, he was only one, so he wasn't a threat. And he sort of acquiesced to them. He sort of surrendered himself to them versus having his own personality. Before, I was getting ready to get married, and he came up, and we looked for places to stay, and they either just rented it or they didn't have anything for us, and we knew through experience that they weren't going to rent to us. And I just rented it, or no, we don't have any place. We no longer have any place to rent, because they didn't want a black person living there, and you knew that. We both knew that, but what could you do? You don't get angry about it, you just move on. So in Sheboygan, I was careful. I did not. If I went to the club, I went with somebody. Or I went, I made sure it was a good sized group, and I was with somebody. I rarely went back to the ship alone. Well, originally I was to be permanent on the Mackinaw, but what happened was the guy that I mentioned before that had been there the longest, and he was the only one, he got into a fight at the bar. and it drew all the other blacks into the fight. And then it was like I wasn't there for the fight. I just know they all came back. All the blacks came back to the ship, and they said that these guys started a fight in the pool room, and they had to leave. And then the next morning, they worked up orders. They called the 9th Coast Guard District then, and they called the district office, and they got us out of there. So they transferred all of us, including the guy that had been in the longest. But this was an emergency, so they got them out. They got us out of there. They got us out of there. The only person that was left was Kenneth Johnson, and I was the last person to see him. And he was like crying, you got me, tears was in his eyes because he didn't want to be left alone. He told me, I don't want to be left alone. I don't want to be the last one. I said, you'll be okay. I said, man, just keep your head down and look out for yourself. And we hugged before I left, man. And he held on to me. And then I told him goodbye. The last thing, I saw was him, standing on the air castle watching me leave, It was a little sad because of the way, you want to be transferred off for a good reason, that you're going to school or you're going to a better duty station or something like that. It was a little sad, but it was my first actual ship that I served on. I had never served on a ship because in the Marine Corps, I was a combatant. I fought in Vietnam, fought on the ground, and I never was on a ship like other Marines were. They dropped me off in the battlefield, and that's where it was. But this was my first ship, so in a lot of ways it was fun, And she was good boat. The captain was Lawrence White. You have a connection with the ship that you live on, and you may think of it as a machine, but in many ways she's a living thing. The machinery has its own characteristics. The boat has its own characteristics. Even back in ancient times, dudes who could not read could tell a ship by the way it sailed in the water. You think about the memories you have. The seas on the lake are really rough, and the ship was rolling and stuff. Well, I was getting sick being below spaces, so I went up on the bridge and took a guy's place. And, the air was up there was better for me, and you see the seas crashing over the bow and stuff like that. And I was okay. I was okay. I remember that. Coast Guard, Marine Corps, Army National Guard, any of them, I was a serviceman. I was the color of that uniform. If you had something racial about it, we'd talk about it after hours. But I was that, and I always will be that. I am, without a doubt, I have proven that I'm an American. It was a good job. It was a good experience, a good adventure. I'm an American. That's why I served.
Yeah. Well, cool. Yeah. Well, that's why I served too, and thank you for your service, Dad.
Thank you for yours. Love you and proud of you.
All right, love you too. Bye. There it is, the story of the Mackinaw, and personal stories that you probably never heard. If you currently live in Sheboygan, have been to Sheboygan, and know anybody who lives in Sheboygan, is it still rough like that? I talked to a few ex-coasties that were on the ship and who were stationed in Sheboygan, and even white sailors had issues there. So is it still rough there? Is it still difficult for coasties? Let me know in the comments. I'm really curious about that. If you're new to the channel, subscribe. I have a lot more content for you. And like the video and share it with your friends. Maybe they've never heard this story before. Anyway, on to the next adventure. Talk to you soon. Love you.